My bike's on 145 hours now. I had intended to overhaul the top end at 150 hours, but the weather's not so good this weekend, so I'm going to do it now. So this video is going to show how to replace the piston and rings. Okay, I've taken the seat and tank off. I've cleaned out all around the engine and the frame so no dirt can drop down while I'm working on the engine. And I decided to do a compression test. And it's reading about 210 psi, which is pretty much the same as I measured before in previous tests, which indicates the engine's still in good condition. But just going on the number of hours the engine's done now, I think it's a good time to change the piston and rings. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. This is the KTM piston kit I purchased. You can see the part number there. This is what's included in the new piston kit. Obviously a new piston and rings. And you can see there the part number for the piston. New wrist pin and circlips. 2 O-rings for the head and small end bearing. And then you get a various selection of base gaskets, different thicknesses, and also the side cover gaskets. When doing any major work on the bike, it's a good idea to disconnect the battery. So I'm just going to remove the ground terminal, and that way I can be certain that if any wires touch the frame or anything like that, it's not going to result in any damage or blown fuses. And I'm going to remove the silencer. It makes removing the pipe a bit easier. So it's just held on with two bolts, so it's pretty easy to do. Okay, next I'm going to remove the pipe. There's a couple of pipe springs and 2 bolts to remove. So I use a spring puller to remove the springs. Then the pipe is held on with bolts here and here, so you have to remove those. And then you can just lift the pipe off. The next step is to drain the coolant, and you remove this bolt and the coolant will come out. I've already removed the radiator cap. If you leave the radiator cap on, it will drain very slowly. So I've got a bucket and a funnel, and I'm just going to remove the bolt and drain it into the bucket. Once the coolant is drained, you can replace the bolt. And then this needs to be torqued to 10 Newton meters. So make sure you have the copper washer on. Okay. The next step is to remove the engine braces. There's one on each side, and the bolts are T45. So initially just loosen them, and then you can remove them, the bolts. One tip I have when working on a job like this is to use trays and organize your parts into different groups. Then when you come to reassembly, it'll be a lot easier to figure out what goes where. And next I'll take the other engine brace off. The next thing I'm going to do is remove the coolant hose. So from the head there's a hose there, and then between each radiator at the bottom there's a cross hose. Which, if you remove this, it'll make it a lot easier to remove the cylinder. As I remove more parts, I'm also cleaning those parts. Some of them I couldn't access properly before when I was washing the bike, and you don't want any of the dirt dropping down into the engine when you take the cylinder off. So I'm wiping with a cloth and also using compressed air to blow out dust, etc. Next, you can pull off the vent hose. Okay, I'm going to replace my spark plug, so I'm going to take the plug out. If you're going to continue using the same one, you can just leave it in. Next, you can loosen the head bolts, and you want to do it in a crisscross pattern. So start with one bolt and loosen it, and then go over to the other side and work in a star pattern. And this prevents the head being warped, damaged. And the same when you're tightening it, you want to do a crisscross pattern. Then you can go ahead and take the head off. Usually it's stuck a little bit, so you can use a soft mallet and just tap, and it should come off fairly easily. So in this case, the O-rings have come off with the head. One other thing is note that there's 2 pins, and make sure those are located in the cylinder and you don't lose those. The next step is to remove the power valve linkage, which is located behind this cover. So you need to remove these 3 bolts. Once you've removed the 3 bolts, you can remove the cover, just slide it out, and it should come off pretty easily. The power valve linkage has a ball joint, and it's held in place with a retainer clip. The first time you take it off, it's actually a little bit difficult to understand how the retainer is held on, but if you have a pick tool shaped like this, you can put it underneath the retainer, and the retainer has a loop on the end, so you can position the pick in that and twist it round. So you pull it round like that, and then it just drops down. And it's a good idea to have a cloth in place in case it just drops out, because otherwise it could drop down inside the case. Once you've removed the retainer, you can pull the power valve link off the ball carefully. So I use a screwdriver and carefully pry it off. Then you can remove the gasket. And you also need to remove the power valve cover on this side to access the cylinder stud nut. So this is the same, this is Torx T25. So just remove the 3 bolts on the cover and take the cover off. Now you're ready to remove the cylinder, and the cylinder's held on with 4 stud bolts, so you need to remove the nuts. You can see inside here, inside the power valve cover, you can see one of the stud nuts on each side is inside. There isn't much room. What you can do is lift the control arm up, and that will allow you to fit a ring spanner on there. So you want to loosen all of the stud nuts a little bit, and then fully remove them afterwards. Then once you've loosened all the stud nuts, you can go ahead and fully remove them. Okay, now I'm ready to lift off the cylinder. I've got the piston down pretty much as far as it'll go, and just lift up on the cylinder. And lift it off. You might have to wriggle around with the tubes a little bit. Okay, now with the cylinder off, I've put a cloth around the crank just in case I drop anything so it doesn't drop down inside the crankcases. And I'm ready to take the piston off. The wrist pin is held in with circlips each side. And I'm going to use a flat bladed screwdriver and pry the circlip out. And then on the other side of the piston, this side the circlip is still installed. But using the Tokyo Off-Road piston pin tool, I can insert it into the wrist pin. And I'll just check, it's quite stiff, I can't push it out manually. So what I'm going to do is support the piston with one hand. So what you don't want to do is hammer and not support the piston, because it'll put quite a bit of force on the crank and maybe damage that. So I've got the piston supported with this one hand with the tool in the wrist pin, and then I can tap it out. And you can see it's coming out relatively easily. And then you can just lift it off. Okay, so this is what the piston looks like after 145 hours. You can probably see there's some light scratches, wear marks, but they're very superficial and you can't feel them at all. And there's no significant wear on the piston. You turn it round, you can see it's pretty similar on this side as well. A few light wear marks around these areas, but no major damage. The wrist pin itself, you can probably see it's slightly discoloured, but there's nothing you can feel on it. And then the rings, you can move them fairly easily, so they haven't had a lot of carbon build-up in there. And then the piston top, it's got a little bit of carbon deposits on there, but nothing very significant. And this is the exhaust side of the cylinder. There's no major damage at all, just some very superficial marks. Okay, then inside the power valve it's a little difficult to see, but it's relatively clean. And I'm not actually going to bother disassembling it. I think I can use it for another 150 hours before it really requires an overhaul. There's very little deposit on it, so I'm just going to leave it like that. I'll wipe it out and then reassemble the cylinder. Okay, I finished cleaning the cylinder now. I cleaned off all the gasket sealing areas and then cleaned it out with a clean cloth and some WD-40. So it's looking very clean now, both inside and outside, so it's ready for reassembly. Every time you overhaul the top end, it's a good time to check the crank for play. So pull the crank into the topmost position and then vertically push and pull. If you can feel any play at all, it would indicate the crank bearings need replacing. In this case I can't feel anything, so it's fine. To clean the head I'm just using some parts cleaner and just wipe it out. You can see the deposits come off pretty easily. Then for the more stubborn deposits I'm using some carb cleaner. This is a foam type. And then a stiff brush. And I can see it coming off pretty easily. Okay, that's cleaned up pretty nicely. Before you reassemble the engine, it's important to remove any old gasket which might be left on the sealing surfaces. And you can see around the front there's some gasket material here left. So I'm going to use a razor blade and carefully scrape it off. But it's a good idea to put a rag down in the case so you don't get any debris falling down in. And then carefully using your razor, just scrape the old material off. The piston kit I bought came with a selection of base gaskets, and they're all different thicknesses. The thickness of the base gasket will adjust the cylinder height and have an effect on the compression and squish. So it's important to get the correct gasket thickness. In my case, I'm going to be reusing the stock cylinder. So all I needed to do was measure the stock base gasket thickness and use the same thickness. If you're going to be using a different cylinder, you'll have to calculate the X dimension, and one other method is measuring the squish. One thing to note is that the base gasket that was fitted on my bike, I thought it looked like one gasket, but when you look carefully, it's actually two placed on top of each other. So I just measured the thickness of each of the gaskets. So there's a 0.2 and a 0.35, and then find the same thickness gaskets in the kit and place them together and use those. And the kit comes with a new small end bearing, and I've applied some two-stroke oil to it. The piston kit comes with a new wrist pin and also circlips. One issue with these circlips is they're very difficult to install without damaging the piston. So I'm not actually going to use these. I'm going to use these ones, which are called easy clips. And you can use some needle nose pliers to compress the circlip and easily put it into the piston. Before you install the piston, it's a good idea to install one side of the circlip into the piston while you still have it on the bench. So it's a lot easier. So using my easy circlips and compress it using some needle nose pliers, and then you can install it into the piston. And I just felt it clip into place. And it's important to position the open end of the circlip either at the top or the bottom. My preference is to actually have it at the top. I think if you have it at the bottom, these openings, the open end of the circlip kind of rests in there, so I don't think it's quite so secure. So I prefer having it at the top like that, and make sure the circlip is fully engaged in the groove. And before installation, I'm going to apply some two-stroke oil to the wrist pin. You don't need a lot, just a thin film. And also I'm going to apply some to the piston and rings. I know some people apply or don't apply any oil and install it dry, but I think it's a bit better to have a film of oil on everything initially. Okay, so now I'm ready to install the piston, and one very important thing with the piston is to get it installed the right way round. So if you look at the top of the piston, there's an arrow on one side, and this should be pointing towards the exhaust. And then I have the wrist pin partially inserted, and I can slip the piston over, and then checking the alignment, carefully push the wrist pin through the bearing, and it should push in fairly easily, and you can see there it's installed now. Then you can grab your second circlip and using your pliers compress it, and I'm going to have the gap up the top. So make sure that the gap is right at the very top and it's fully inserted into the or fully seated in the groove. Okay, we're now ready to install the cylinder, and at the back of the piston is where you need the ring gaps. If you look carefully in the ring grooves, there's two pins in there, and you need to get the ring gap to align with those pins. So rotate the rings, make sure it lines up correctly, and then compress the rings with one hand, and then grab your cylinder with the other hand, and being careful not to scratch the piston, install the cylinder. So just take your time. Make sure it's lined up, and definitely don't force anything. Okay, once you have the piston installed inside the cylinder, check that the piston moves freely, so you can use the Kickstarter to do that. And if the rings aren't installed correctly and catching on the cylinder, it'd be pretty obvious. They'll tend to lift the cylinder up, and as you can see, it goes very smoothly, so there's no issues there. Okay, the next step is to install these stud nuts. So you got 4, and you should then torque them down in a crisscross pattern. The spec for these nuts is 35 Newton meters, but the front nuts you're not going to be able to get a torque wrench on there easily, so I'm just going to do that by hand. Okay, I have nuts on all of the studs now, so I'm going to tighten them in a crisscross pattern. So this one first, and then the opposite side, and then come back and do this one. And then the opposite corner. And next I'm going to tighten them to spec. Once you have the cylinder torqued down, you can check the X dimension. The X dimension is the distance between the side of the cylinder and the top of the piston. And on 17 model pistons, they're actually domed. So if I move it up, I think you can probably see the center section of the piston is higher than the side section. So in this case, the X dimension is the measurement from the top of the cylinder to the side of the piston, and that needs to be between 0 and 0.1 millimeter. So I've put the bike in gear, in 3rd gear, and I can use the rear wheel to move the piston into top dead center and then hold it in position while I do the measurement. So I've got my straight edge, and I can see there's a very slight gap, and I've got a 0.1 millimeter feeler gauge, and that won't actually fit in the gap. So I know the X dimension is between 0 and 0.1 millimeters. So it's within spec, and I can leave it like that. If it was a larger gap or smaller gap, what I'd need to do is take the cylinder off and use a thicker or thinner base gasket to make the adjustment. The next step is to install the power valve side cover gasket. Make sure it's lined up correctly and is fully seated. Then you can install the power valve linkage. So just push it on to the ball, make sure it clicks on properly, and then it's a good idea to use a cloth around the gap on the bottom in case the retainer pops off while you're installing it. And the retainer goes on from the bottom, so feed it up and then just press it round, and it should clip into place. Okay, next we can install the cover. So line it up correctly, push it on, and then the fasteners, you need some Loctite on them. I'm using a medium strength Loctite, just a small amount. And the torque on these is very low, so the spec is 4 Newton meters. So if you don't have a small torque wrench, be very careful not to over torque these. Okay, so next I can install the power valve side cover on the other side. So I've applied some medium strength Loctite to the bolts, and these torque to the same 4 Newton meters as the other side. The next step is to install a head, and you need to use the new O-rings that came with the kit. I've smeared some silicone grease on the O-rings, and that helps keep them in the groove on top of the cylinder while you're installing the head. So I think that's a good idea. And confirm that the O-rings are seated nicely in the grooves. If they're poking out, obviously it's not going to seal well and you'll have problems, water leaks, etc. So this is an important step, and I recommend using some grease. Then next I can install the head, and there's 2 locating pins which you need to position correctly. So make sure those go into the head properly. And then you've got 6 head bolts, and it's important to use new copper washers. Okay, once you have the head bolts finger tight, you can use a wrench, and going in a star pattern, start to tighten them. So initially just snug the bolts down. Then when you've snugged all the bolts down, you want to fasten them to torque, which is 27 Newton meters. So again, do this in a star pattern. Okay, I've just done a compression test with the new piston, and I'm getting 210, which is pretty much exactly the same as what I had before. So everything looks good anyway. And I'm going to put in a new spark plug. I like to use a little bit of anti-seize on the threads, so I've already put some on. I'm now ready to reconnect the coolant hoses. Then you can reinstall the spark plug cap. The next step is to reinstall the engine braces and use these bolts, which are held in place with Loctite, but you can see there's still quite a bit of old Loctite left, so I like to run them through a die before installing them. Then on all the engine brace bolts I use medium strength Loctite. Okay, then you can install the brace on the bike, and the long bolt goes into the engine, and the 2 shorter ones go into the frame. Then all of the engine brace bolts need to be torqued to 25 Newton meters. Next I'm going to add coolant. The recommended coolant is this one, the M3.0, made by Motorex. And I'm just going to fill it up using this funnel. Then once you've filled the coolant up, I typically tip the bike over just to get rid of some of the trapped air in the radiator. And then on the 17 and newer bikes, there's a air drain on top of the head, which once you've filled the coolant system up, you just loosen this off, and it allows any trapped air to escape. And there I can see some water coming out now, so I can retighten it. And then recheck the level in the radiator. So I'm just going to add a tiny little bit more, and that should be good. And then install the radiator cap. Then reinstall the vent tube. So I've still got to put the pipe, the tank and the seat back on, but other than that, that's the engine rebuild complete. As I think you saw, it's a fairly straightforward process, and really the trickiest part was putting the cylinder back over the piston and not damaging the rings. But just take your time and be careful, and it should go fairly smoothly. You do need a few tools to do the rebuild, but once you have those, you can certainly save a lot of money by doing it yourself.